As the defendant literally blows her brains out, he whoops. As this rock crashes through her back windshield, he says, "Holy."
I hate the saying, boys will be boys. I have 2 boys of my own, and I know boys engage in stereotypical behavior at times. But then again, so does my daughter. I don't like the phrase, boys will be boys, because I feel like sometimes people use it as a blanket excuse to downplay terrible behavior. And people, even teenagers, need to be held accountable for their behavior. It was a quiet night in April 2023. 20-year-old Alexa Bartell was driving home. She was chatting away on her phone to her girlfriend. Moments later, a senseless act involving 3 teenagers would forever change the lives of multiple families. This true crime case, it really does generally annoy me because it was a truly senseless crime. There was absolutely no point to it. It should have never have happened. This is the tragic case of Alexa Bartell and 3 teenage friends, Joseph Koenig, Nicholas Karol-Chik, and Zachary Kwak. Alexa Bartell lived in Jefferson County, Colorado. She was described as a vibrant 20-year-old and was cherished by her family and friends. She loved animals and she also enjoyed making dancing TikToks. And blue was one of her favorite colors.
I was Alexa Bartell's girlfriend. And I know when death comes, everyone comes out and says how spectacular of a person they were, but I am seriously here to tell you that she was the most ever spectacular person I've met. When they say that she was great, she was more than great, and she taught everybody how to be kind. She was kind. She was the sun in everybody's life.
On the evening of April 19th, around 10:45 p.m, Alexa was driving her yellow Chevy Spark northbound along Indiana Street. This was a quiet stretch of road. It was a dark, hilly road which was poorly lit. And she was talking to her girlfriend Jenna Griggs on the phone, confirming plans to meet up later that evening after Jenna had finished her shift working at the restaurant. Suddenly, mid-telephone conversation, the phone line abruptly just went dead, just like that. Jenna thought, well, maybe the phone signal had, cut out or something. Maybe her battery had died. So immediately, Jenna called Alexa back. She tried to call her at least 10 times, but there was just no answer. Nothing. Jenna's mind started to wander. She thought possibly Alexa might have been annoyed at something. Thankfully, Jenna could track Alexa's location via the Find My Phone app. She'd noticed that Alexa was no longer driving, and it appeared that she was like in a field area just off Indiana Street. Weird. So Jenna contacted Alexa's mum, Kelly Bartell, to inquire if she had heard from her daughter. She hadn't. Finishing her shift, Jenna then drove to the location that was indicated on her phone. When she arrived, she noticed that the fence that was by the road had been broken and Alexa's car had rammed through this fence. So Jenna drove up to Alexa's car, and what she encountered was just so horrific, so much so I can't really sufficiently explain it in this video. But in summary, there was a huge hole in Alexa's windshield and she saw blood and brain matter. Tragically, Alexa passed away instantly on immediate impact. It was blunt force trauma.
They don't let her go see her daughter, or what was left of her daughter. They don't let her go see her daughter, whose face is not only unrecognizable, but whose face is not there. They don't let her go see her daughter, whose head is an empty cavity because her brain is in the back seat.
The emergency services were called out there, and so was Kelly, Alexa's mum. The scene was so horrific that I understand that the first responders didn't even want Alexa's mother to see her daughter, so they shielded her from the full extent of the scene of the crime. The incident was so awful that the first responder that showed up on the scene, she later had to medically retire due to mental health issues, and she now actually advocates for better mental health support for first responders. So, what happened to Alexa Bartell? 1 minute she was peacefully driving her car along the road, and the next she was gone. And who was responsible? Well, the question of who was responsible proved controversial later in court, with conflicting accounts from the defendants. Joseph Koenig and Nicholas Karol-Chik, or Mitch as Nicholas was called, were best friends. They were super close. Mitch described them as being almost like brothers. They were childhood friends. At the time that this incident occurred, both boys were 18 years old. And for some reason I will never quite fathom, Joseph and Mitch began to engage in rock throwing. Mitch called it a hobby, but it wasn't like an innocent sport, that you would imagine, teenage boys throwing rocks into the water or the river or something. Oh no, not Joseph and not Mitch. They were throwing large rocks. When I say large rocks, I mean like a landscaping rock out of their moving car, directly at other moving cars, just for the thrill and the adrenaline rush. No other gains could be had from this activity. It was just senseless, like I said. Mitch explained that they engaged in this rock throwing activity regularly.
And throwing large landscaping rocks primarily at oncoming drivers as they passed. Those relative speeds and velocities combining, creating enough force for that rock, or those rocks, to smash through windshields.
So the kind of trouble that Joseph and Mitch were getting into with this rock throwing happened on February 25th, 2023. Around 10 p.m, they threw a large landscaping rock at a man's car. This man was called Michael Marasco. The rock smashed through his windshield and caused him to veer off the road. Michael's car then crashed into a trash can, and his son was in the car with him, covered in glass from the broken windshield. This rock and then subsequent car crash could have killed Michael and his son. You would think that this incident would have been a warning to the boys, but no, they continued. And only 2 weeks before Alexa was struck, at least 6 other drivers had reported being hit by these rocks.
Among them, Nathan Tipton, who shared his story as investigators were searching for suspects.
My first initial reaction when it happened was anger. I thought that, somebody intentionally threw something at my car and damaged my car, could have done something else to myself.
Joseph Koenig, Nicholas Karol-Chik, and Zachary Kwak were arrested and connected to those cases.
Another driver reported that he was hit by a huge statue. It was a statue of Zeus, his head. It was thrown at a moving vehicle. And how do we know it was Joseph and Mitch? Because CCTV cameras inside a store actually captured the 2 teenage boys carrying this Zeus statue just before the incident took place. If only the teens had been apprehended at this point. But no, things escalated. Not only was it Joseph and Mitch who threw rocks, they then introduced more of their friends to this senseless, wicked behaviour. The teens met this other boy called Zachary Kwak. known as Zach, at a live music concert venue in Colorado called the Grizzly Rose. It's crazy to later discover that even though Joseph and Mitch had been long-time childhood friends, they had actually only met Zach just a few weeks prior to the murder of Alexa Bartell. So this trio friendship group was fairly new. Despite not knowing Zach for very long, on a few occasions he did join Mitch and Joseph to play out their sick game of throwing rocks. The boys threw these rocks late at night, so it was harder for them to be detected. So on April 19, 2023, the trio arranged via a Snapchat message to meet up that evening. Joseph and Mitch drove to Zach's house to pick him up in Mitch's Chevy truck. There was actually a fourth friend that had also arranged to meet them by the name of Joseph Bopp, another Joseph, one of Joseph Koenig's former co-workers. So Bopp also initially agreed to hang out with the trio, but when the boys went to a Walmart to gather landscaping rocks to put in their truck, Bopp knew something was going on. He knew something was going to go down, so Bopp, said he didn't want to be a part of it and asked the other boys to take him home, which they did. Bopp later described Joseph as somebody who participates in destructive behaviour and liked chaos. And Bopp choosing not to participate that night is actually evidence that teenage boys do have some impulse control and they can decide not to do something bad. They can pick and do the right thing. So now left riding in the truck was Joseph, Mitch and Zach. They started driving around for a few hours. Mitch was in the front seat, Joseph was driving and Zach was in the back seat. Apparently the boys claimed that this rock throwing incident was going to be their last throw of the night. Don't know if I believe that, but that's what they said. So the three boys were driving southbound along Indiana Street, and that's when they saw Alexa's headlights in the distance as she drove northbound on the same street. And that's when Joseph decided to speed up his truck, and he began driving at 80 miles per hour. Past the speed limit. Joseph hurled a rock from his roll-down driver's side window towards Alexa, just like throwing a shot put. This rock, this 9-pound rock, landscaping rock, hit Alexa's car. And the velocity of, both cars moving in opposite directions caused the rock to violently smash through her windshield, striking her in the face, where she veered off the road into the field where Jenna later found her, which I had explained earlier. Mitch later testified in court that Joseph let out a whoop in pure excitement. Just disgusting. Sick individuals. They saw Alexa's car lose control in front of their eyes. And if this wasn't bad enough, the boys then said they just had to go back. They made a U-turn to drive past the scene of the crime, not once, not twice, but 3 times, to look at the destruction and death they had caused. And what is so disturbing is that then Zach decided to take a photo on his cell phone as a twisted memento, which he then shared to the other boys inside their little Snapchat group. During those 3 times the boys drove past, gawping at Alexa, nobody thought, hey, maybe we should get some help. Maybe we should call the ambulance. Maybe we should do something. Nope, it was just like a game to them. It was like GTA or something. As if they were just indifferent to whether the driver was fatally injured or hurt. I don't understand how they claim that they truly didn't mean to cause any harm, but then when they did realise that they had caused some harm, that they didn't try and help in any way. After Alexa had been struck, Mitch explained that Joseph kept turning around from his seat to look at me and look at Zach, smiling with this big grin on his face. Just, again, sick. It's sick.
When you passed Alexa Bartell's car off the road, how was defendant Koenig acting?
It's hard to tell. He was, excited.
When either he hit or passed Alexa Bartell's car, did he ever make a whoop sound?
Yes.
Can you describe that whoop sound and when he made that whoop sound?
So it was when we were passing by for the second time that we were going northbound and saw the car on the side of the road that he did that.
The boys threw out the remaining rocks out of their truck onto the shoulder of the road to get rid of the incriminating evidence. So they knew. They knew what they had done was wrong. Joseph, Mitch and Zach all agreed to keep this incident to themselves, to keep silent. Zach even said that Joseph met with them to get their story straight and specifically deny any involvement. These boys really thought that they could stay hush-hush and get away with something so catastrophic. Like, come on now. The truth had to come out, and indeed it did. So how did the boys get captured? Joseph Bopp, you remember the boy, the fourth boy who was riding along in the truck, who decided not to go along with the rock throwing that night? Well, he spoke to the police. And what actually solidified the boys getting captured was that their cell phones were tracked to the cell phone tower near the location of Alexa's murder, as well as other rock throwing incidents. This cell phone data was analysed, and when the same phone number kept appearing multiple times, the number was traced back to the Joseph residence. The police were also able to obtain camera footage of some rock throwing incidents, which again showed that there was only one pickup truck on the road at the time, which linked to the boys. Witnesses who were at the Walmart when they were, collecting the landscaping rocks also came forward revealing that they had seen the boys. All of this data linked the boys to the crime, and they were arrested and charged. Mitch and Zach pleaded guilty to several offences and took a plea deal for a lesser sentence. Part of their plea deal involved them testifying against their friend Joseph. Joseph, however, did not agree to this plea deal, but instead he decided to go to trial, where he chose not even to testify himself. How are you going to make everybody go to court just to not speak your piece? Make that make sense? But probably because he knew there was nothing he could say in that courtroom, no excuse he could give that would really defend his actions. Nothing the court would believe. His lawyer did try on his behalf to provide defence, but the evidence against Joseph was just too damning. The trial was very emotional, and some of the testimonies and arguments put forth were outright conflicting. For example, Mitch had claimed that it was Zach who had thrown the fatal rock. Bear in mind that Joseph had been his lifelong friend, so Zach was the newcomer to the group. But then Mitch later changed his story and testified in court that it was actually Joseph who had thrown the rock. Joseph was in the driver's seat and he was left-handed, which the facts were consistent with the rock being thrown by Joseph. Zach's story had also gone through some changes. Firstly, when he was questioned, he denied all knowledge of the incident and denied even being there. But then, when he was presented with some more evidence that he was there, he then changed his story. He said that he was there, but he said he didn't throw any rocks at all. so he couldn't have thrown the fatal rock. But then Joseph's defense lawyer claimed that it was Zach who threw the rock. Their stories were just all over the place, conflicting. It was confusing. Somebody here was clearly lying. The three boys who were once friends now turned on each other with their testimony. It was each man for himself.
Was this the rock on Indiana Street that killed Alexa Bartell?
Yes, ma'am.
Where was everyone seated in the truck at that time?
Joseph Koenig was in the driver's seat. Nicholas Karol-Chik was in the passenger seat, and I was sitting directly behind Nicholas Karol-Chik.
And while all of this is going on with this rock and 103 miles an hour, you, who believe yourself to be a leader, didn't say, don't throw that. Did you?
I have to live with that every day.
People who loved Alexa Bartell did not buy Zach Kwak's version of events of the night of April 19th, 2023. Not his assertion that he threw no rocks.
And he sat right there. And it was lie after lie after lie.
Not his testimony that he asked his accomplices to take him home, and they refused.
I'm sorry, I believe none of that. I think he is just involved in what they all call complete chaos.
Even though Zach appeared to take a lesser role in the crime, Alexa's cousin, Erin Miller, said that she couldn't shake that deep and unsettling feeling that what he said wasn't entirely true. I still believe his actions are just as guilty as the others. I do not believe that we heard the full truth about what happened that night. And I agree with Alexa's cousin. There are still many holes to the story, and it's unfortunate that their stories had so many changing, conflicting points. They still all didn't agree that Joseph actually threw the fatal rock. But will we ever really know the truth? But ultimately, Mitch and Zach both claimed some guilt for their role, so they were sentenced to time in prison. Zach pleaded guilty to second-degree assault and attempted second-degree assault for rocks that were thrown earlier in the night. He was sentenced to 20 to 32 years. Whilst Mitch pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and for attempted first-degree murder, which he received a sentence ranging from 34 to 72 years, depending on if and when he would be released on parole. Joseph, however, dragged this whole ordeal out and would not take a plea deal. Why? I don't know. Because his other co-defendants had already got lengthy sentences and were going to testify against him, and he knew this as part of their plea deals. So Joseph must have known that he wasn't going to, meet a positive outcome. But anyway, his defense team raised arguments of him being merely 18 years old at the time and therefore not having a fully developed mind to practice impulse control. They also tried to use the justification that Joseph suffered from a borderline personality disorder. They claimed that Joseph didn't intend to kill anybody. But realistically, I think that any 18-year-old would know that throwing a rock could potentially kill somebody when you're going 80 miles per hour. And the jury didn't buy his excuses either. When it came to Zach, his mother said he had both bipolar disorder and ADHD and had been bullied for his Korean heritage, but that's not a good enough justification. And for Mitch, of course, we heard the old age excuse from parents of a criminal, i.e., he was a good boy and he would never hurt anybody. Mitch's mother begged the courtroom not to send her son to prison because he is vulnerable.
He is not a hateful, mean child. Nicholas is the most sweet person I have ever met. And I know my comments are going to anger people, and I am so sorry for that, but I am an advocate for my son. My son is not a mean person. He is the most wonderful, gentle soul. He would never hurt anybody on purpose. And I think what is missing here is people don't want to know him. Everybody in this courtroom, we have been coming in this courtroom for 2 years, and everybody in this courtroom hates us. If you send him to DOC, it's another tragedy waiting to happen. He is so vulnerable, but nobody wants to listen. All they want to do is hate. And I can understand where the hate is coming from. I understand why they hate him. But nobody gets it. You see him as an individual, see him as a person, see him as the good kid he is. He is not a hateful person, and he has never hurt anybody, nor would he ever hurt anybody on purpose. Please, I'm begging you, don't throw my baby away. Don't waste his life. Don't make him a throwaway kid, because I know he has so much good in his heart. Thank you.
But nobody in that courtroom could excuse a bunch of teenage boys throwing rocks at innocent, unsuspecting victims in the name of fun and thrill-seeking. There's just no excuse for it. Let's look a bit deeper beyond the facts of Alexa Bartell's case and discuss the psychology of possibly why this senseless crime even occurred. Trying to understand why something happened isn't to justify or excuse their horrific behavior, but it's important that we try to understand, the root causes, not only for prevention, but intervention. So the act of throwing rocks at moving car is far more than a prank. It's a symptom of a deeper psychological and social issue. It combines thrill-seeking and lack of foresight, peer pressure, and in some cases, sadistic antisocial tendencies. The fact that Joseph was excited and shouted "whoop" after he struck Alexa's car has sadistic tendencies, i.e. he enjoys harming others and takes delight in it. Joseph has been described as destructive in the past. The fact that the boys didn't call for help and even took photos of the aftermath shows a complete lack of empathy. As soon as they saw serious damage had occurred, you would think that they would come to their senses and think, okay, we've done something, we've gone a bit too far now, and at this point we need to seek some help. But they didn't. At some point, Zach was playing on his phone in the car, but he had turned his phone off onto airplane mode, suggesting that he knew what he was doing was wrong, but he just didn't want to get tracked.
And Nada's claim that during the attacks he played video games on his phone, a phone that didn't ping a single cell phone tower in the area, meaning it was in airplane mode or turned off.
That's something you do when you don't want to be found. When you're trying to hide what you are doing and where you are doing it at.
And because Joseph and Mitch had regularly met up to throw these rocks, time and time again, clearly shows a repeated pattern of behavior. It wasn't just a one-off, spontaneous, let's throw a rock. No, this is something the boys were planning. They were doing regularly and they were looking forward to doing it. There's something very abnormal about repeatedly committing a crime over and over again. Another factor that we have to consider are the dynamics between the group. So when a group of teenage boys get together, there's often a sense of heightened rebellion and being, untouchable almost. That group bravado mentality. And with Zach being the newest member of the group, there's a good chance that he was trying to, impress them and seek a better social standing with his new friends. And lastly, there's just boredom. The fact that a bunch of teenage boys driving around at night screams, "Don't you have anything better to do?" You really couldn't find a movie to watch, a bowling alley to play at, a concert to attend. When you think about it, absolutely none of these reasons here are good enough reasons of why they could have done what they did. It wasn't worth the life of an innocent victim. We really need to get into the psyche of these teenage boys that start showing these tendencies to deter them and to get them help if possible, because they need to know the outcome of what they're doing is going to be death and a murder conviction. Like, throwing rocks isn't a game. What's even more disturbing is that these cases of rock throwing incidents have been seen time and time again. And it's shocking to me just how many cases there are. Like, I did a little deep dive and there's just so many cases and they're just so similar of boys throwing rocks and killing people. It was the same scenario over and over again. But 3 cases in particular stood out to me because all of the similarities between the cases. Firstly is the case of 5 teenage boys in Michigan. In 2017, they killed 32-year-old Kenneth White. The boys are throwing rocks at cars from an overpass, and the 5 boys confessed to playing a sick game called overpassing, where each time they hit a car, which they called a dinger, they earned points. And they competed in this game for money. Just like Joseph, Mitch, and Zach, the Michigan boys also prepped their rock killing spree by loading a truck with rocks they found on the street in their pickup truck. What's also similar is after the Michigan boys hit Kenneth's truck, they fled and they didn't seek help. They actually went to a restaurant to eat. And once they heard of Kenneth's death, they started texting each other, saying, "Lay low, no one rat us out." Again, more teenagers really thinking that they could get away with a murder. Kenneth was actually a passenger in the car. He was riding with his co-worker as they were construction workers. The rock fractured his skull and his chest, and like Alexa, he died from blunt force trauma. But what I find starkly different in this Michigan case was the fairly light sentence that these 5 Michigan boys received in comparison to the sentences that the boys were dished out in Alexa Bartell's case. These Michigan boys are actually sentenced as juveniles, as they were 17 rather than 18. So these boys only served very short sentences. For example, one only served 39 months and another 43 months. Even the boy who threw the fatal rock that killed Kenneth, his name was Karl Anger, only spent 3 years. 3 years, even though he was sentenced 3 to 20 years. After taking an innocent life. Like, that's crazy to me. The second case that struck similarities to Alexa case also occurred in 2017, but this time in Ohio. In this case, 4 teenage boys were throwing rocks over the highway bridge, and then they noticed some sandbags on the bridge. One boy, Pedro Salinas, who was just 13 years old, threw a sandbag and it hit and killed Marquise Bird. Marquise was 22 and was sitting in the passenger seat. Marquise had a young baby and a fiance. In court, Marquise's mother said that she could never forgive his killer Pedro. And again, these boys served relatively brief sentences in comparison to the sentences of the boys in Alexa Bartell's case. Pedro was then released from the youth treatment center just 2 years later when he was 15 years old. And in a crazy turn of events, just 2 weeks after being released from the youth treatment center, Pedro actually died. He actually drowned in a local quarry whilst swimming.
The 4 young teens responsible for killing Marquise Bird back in 2017 after a sandbag was thrown over an overpass in Toledo were sent to a youth treatment center and then released.
They're getting a second chance at life, a chance that my son would never ever have.
When they committed the crime, they were 13 and 14 years old.
Just unbelievable, really, because when they walk in the room, you look at them, and they're so tiny. They're little kids. But them being tiny has had such a large impact on my life.
This past summer, one of the boys, Pedro Salinas, was found unresponsive in the water at an outdoor recreation center in Ohio. He would later die.
I cried, really. It wasn't a cry of happiness. It wasn't a cry of sadness. It was a cry of another family is going to experience what I'm going through.
And lastly, another key case of rock throwing that I want to mention is the case of Sharon Budd. This occurred in 2014. This was yet again another high-profile case of 4 teens throwing rocks from an overpass in Pennsylvania. The rock smashed through the car and hit Sharon directly in her face. However, by some miracle, Sharon survived. However, she was severely disfigured and also blinded in one eye. Her husband Randy and daughter Kaylee were in the car at the time. They said it sounded like an explosion. Just like in Alexa Bartell's case, when the rock hit the car, the boys who did it cheered. They thought it was funny. Later that same night, they even returned back to the scene of the crime twice to see their destruction, just like Joseph, Mitch, and Zach had done. But again, the sentences handed out to these boys in Pennsylvania were fairly short. I guess it was taken into consideration that they didn't actually kill Sharon Budd, although they could have very well have. Sharon was 53 years old. She was a teacher, and she was really brave that after the incident, instead of hiding away because of her facial disfigurement and blindness, she actually made many media appearances to raise awareness of these kind of cases.
My head was hit, this front part was removed.
Sharon Budd lost her right eye, suffered brain damage, and recently underwent her 7th major surgery, all because a group of teens made the choice to throw a big rock from a Pennsylvania overpass and into her car. Friday will mark 1 year since the horrific incident, which happened while the teacher was traveling to New York with her husband and daughter.
I'm just surprised that of all the cars that were going under that overpass, that our car was picked.
But sadly, 2 years after her assault, her husband Randy ended up passing away after he took his own life. He had advocated for the state of Ohio to install protective fences on these overpasses. The fact that Sharon's husband took his own life after this incident just goes to show that these rock-throwing incidents don't just impact the person who gets hit, it impacts their whole family. So back to Alexa Bartell's case. Regarding Joseph, he was the last one of the trio to be held accountable in court. Jurors ended up convicting Joseph of murder in the first degree, extreme indifference. In addition, Joseph was also convicted of attempted murder and other less serious crimes for the rocks that he had thrown previously at other victims. On June the 3rd, 2023, Joseph would be sentenced to an automatic life sentence without the possibility of parole. Once the boys' convictions were announced, Kelly Bartell, Alexa Bartell's mother, stated, "It's hard to feel happy or feel satisfied that justice was served today because I feel one amazing life was lost and 3 others were lost and impacted." The verdict was bittersweet. She was glad that the perpetrators received heavy sentences for their crimes, but ultimately no amount of years would be enough to bring back the loss of her cherished daughter.
This has been obviously the hardest 2 years ever, and we got justice today. And I don't know how to feel about it. I'm happy. It doesn't bring Alexa back. And that's horrible, but we don't ever want this to happen again to anybody else.
The fact that Kelly is even able to think about the impacts on the lives of these 3 boys who killed her own daughter shows strength. because the outcome of the boys' lives was something that could have been controlled. They had full control over their decisions that day, but Alexa didn't. Alexa didn't choose any of it. She was completely innocent and paid such a dear price. The long sentences handed down in Alexa's case range from 20 years all the way up to life in prison with no parole. Compared to the previous short sentences that some of the other cases, some of the similar cases of rock throwing, it's just really apparent that now the law is cracking down on this behavior. The boys will be boys excuse simply won't cut it. Teenage boys, beware. Take up a hobby, axe throwing, bow and arrow shooting, anything. Just don't think you can throw rocks and not get caught and not get slapped with some serious time, because it's just not worth it. This is the case of Alexa Bartell, Joseph Koenig, Mitch Karol-Chik, and Zach Kwak.